It's an honor to be present here to expand on the legacy of Ronald Coase, who was so provocative, so undriven by fads, and to take his own independent course, which has, in the long run, been so very productive in so many fields. I want to expand today on the research possibilities as where we might go next in research effort to carry out one aspect of Ronald Coase's program, and that's, of course, his original paper on the theory of the firm, one which has had been cited a great many times, and yet I think not really very much developed. That there's been not as much work done in the program, and I want to suggest a number of research problems that are aroused, at least to me, by contemplating this paper. Of course, there has been important work since then, especially by Oliver Williamson. I might also cite Herbert Simon, who has dealt with some aspects of Coase's work. I'm not sure whether he cited him or not, actually. That's the proposition, a straightforward observation, that the price system is not used within firms. Actually, it is today, but solely for the purpose of minimizing taxes. We have, of course, internal pricing in large, complicated firms, particularly those involved in international transactions. But as far as I can make out, they play absolutely no role in allocative decisions. It's simply designed to make sure that most of the business takes place in countries or states with low tax rates. This is not quite, I think, what Ronald Coase would have regarded as appropriate. And he specifies really two reasons, which, namely, one is that the price system is costly in information terms, and that is indeed the origin of one origin of the transaction cost economy argument, the idea that firms trying to minimize transaction costs, that humans try to minimize transaction costs, because this is not only applicable to firms, that it's also costly in terms of specifying the rules of action, and I think particularly of contracts. A contract is a statement, you'll do this under this conditions or whatever. Instead of a contractual relationship to perform specific tasks, we have a general rule of authority. Orders are given, directions. Now, these are subject to limitations, of course, that you can't do anything possible, but within limitations, people are assigned. I should tell you, I enjoyed the benefits of organization with authoritative relationships. Namely, I was in the military. And it wasn't always obvious that direct authority necessarily led to efficient transactions or efficient information transmission, I can assure you. But I won't try to regale you with my stories about that. Now, this raises an interesting question. Presumably prices, market transactions, do play a basic role, in fact, a somewhat unquestioned role in Coase's account with regard to inter-firm communication and inter-firm transactions, delivery of goods, statement, you'll exchange money for goods, or will exchange money for a commitment to deliver the goods within a certain length of time or to perform certain services. And these are carried out in a market, and we usually describe it, and Coase doesn't challenge that, in a price system. And I want to come back to that a little bit later. But let me say, on the other hand, so the question is, why is it that Inter-firm communication takes place with prices, while intra-firm allocations seem to have what is clearly a superior thing, superior from the point of view of the operation of the firm, which presumably means superior in the form of minimizing costs or increasing profits. Now, why is this true? I think some ideas have been developed over the intervening period, and I think some of them should be explored more. I think one set of insights comes from the development of communication theory and information theory. This will probably be a little too tidy and too unrealistic for Ronald Coase's views, but I think it does point in a direction. Namely, that we have a set of possible communications. And what is going to be communicated, the items to be communicated, have certain probabilities of occurrence. You may want to design a language to communicate this. You have to communicate. You have to have a message appropriate to every possible communication. And you want to choose that language to minimize costs. When the first telegraph codes were introduced, the letter E was given a dot, a single dot. Other letters could be maybe dashes and dots, but E, which is the most frequent letter, had the shortest. In other words, the general principle is that messages about items that are very frequent, when you're going to send the same message, those are the ones that are represented, involve the least cost. Frequently, and in general, if you look at the way you speak, words that are used frequently are generally very short. Words that, or to another example, which rather annoys me, is the use of acronyms. Now, you can't pick up a paper about policy or even technical papers without finding, or even newspapers, without finding acronyms. And I've scratched my head and tried to remember what that acronym means. And sometimes now publications are put with little tables at the beginning, giving the acronyms. But presumably to people who are doing this all the time, they find it immediate to compress a long phrase into 3 letters. So these all illustrate the fact that a code develops. Now, within a firm, communication is not about the whole economic world. It's about the problems relating to that firm. So it pays a firm to develop a code. And I mean, when I say pays to develop it, presumably these actually evolve without necessarily with little conscious interference, but they develop. So the firm, after a while, becomes a way of communicating. The members of the firm evolve a way of communicating with each other with a private language. Certain phrases are used over and over again with meanings that require a lot of richness of association, so they mean more than the words appear to mean or would mean to an outsider. Now, of course, that also means something, which, of course, is Coase emphasizes, that a firm consists of relations that have some stability over time. A worker works for a firm. He doesn't shift every day or even every year from one firm to another. In the market description, it doesn't matter which good goes to which person. And if you take the labor market, that means employees and employers can maybe balance supply and demand, but they don't necessarily go to the same firm every time. But it's clearly, in fact, true, and is implicit in Coase's remarks, maybe explicit, I know, that the membership in firms does not change radically. It changes slowly. People do leave, of course, and there is labor mobility, but people stick to jobs for a while. And one of the reasons, clearly, is that that having developed this code, you're more valuable at that job than you are in a new firm where you'd have to learn the codes of behavior. This is what, in fact, Gary Becker called firm-specific human capital. He was referring to the evolution of human capital. He pointed out that some of it is firm-specific. It isn't useful if you go to another firm. And this has all sorts of theoretical and practical implications, which we didn't go into here. There has been at least one study by Andrea Pratt, which has tried to test the idea that firms develop codes and has found evidence for it. A second reason, which is really in Coase's original paper, but I wonder if it needs more exploration, that's incentive questions. Presumably within the firms, so it's assumed, all the individuals are trying to achieve the aim of the firm, presumably profit maximization. They have no incentive to withhold information from each other. They don't have the incentive to distort information. The usual assumptions are, since the individual firm is the profit center, that transactions among firms are not subject to the same limitations. I shouldn't say limited. Well, it's a limitation, but it's a good limitation that you can rely on interfirm communication. I'm sorry, you can rely on intra-firm communication. Whereas interfirm communication, when there's the assumption there, of course, is that firms have different information. They therefore are not necessarily going to reveal all that information. Let me leave aside the deliberate falsehoods, which of course abound in the economic world, and the social world too, for that matter. So you have asymmetric information, and there's a large literature on that, which leads to distortions. In an interfirm communication, or communication between a firm and a consumer, all that really matters are the price and the buyer's information on, let's say, quality. Now, of course, then on top of that, given that, the sellers may try to influence the buyer's information. And we have a rather large amount of economic activity devoted to advertising, which there's a field of economics that people have written papers on occasionally, but really, I don't think I've seen really anything you call a genuine analysis of something which consumes a fairly large amount of economic resources. Advertising is by no means an insignificant part of the economy, just in terms of its own resource use, and is also, of course, has important consequences for the allocation of demand. So I believe but this is, I think, an important part of the implications of Coase's program and need to be studied further. So the incentive about information is part of the reason why of superiority. Now, let me turn to another question, which is the notion of authoritative allocation, which is so prominent in Coase's paper, and it was later taken up by Herbert Simon. As I said, Coase stresses the superiority of authoritative relations. Now he knows that instead of saying you you just follow what I tell you to do, we shift from one department to another, or we change exactly the product mix or the procedure in the department you're in, and you just follow that. We could have a contract which says, if such and such occurs, if we have a new idea as to how to produce the good, your tasks, the tasks you will perform, will change, and we specify how. Now, so the Coase notes that one could have sufficiently complex contracts which would achieve the same aim as authoritative relationships. But, he argues, the cost of drawing up such contracts would be extremely high. This is, by the way, a very important issue for a lot of other considerations. For example, if you have government economic policy, should we have discretionary rules or should we have fixed rules? There's, of course, a lot of prominent economists like Milton Friedman or John Taylor have argued, in the case of monetary policy, for fixed rules. But the implications of Coase's argument are raised essentially that we can't think in advance of all the possibilities. So having a fixed rule denies that. Now, of course, there are arguments on the other side. I don't know if this is the issue here, but I just point out the similarity. The underlying issue, of course, is uncertainty. The firm does not know in advance what will happen. The most prominent example of that are technological innovations. The firm or a competitor of the firm may have an innovation, and you've got to respond to that in some way. You may change your work organization, you may change the products you buy, you may have to demand. There may be shifts in demand, and there may be other competitive pressures. For example, a supplier will raise or lower his or her price, or, well, you can think of a lot of things. And we want, since the firm is facing these uncertainties, it wants to be able to have actions which are appropriate to the actual occurrences. Now, as I've already suggested, well, you could have a contract, and that, of course, is the standard approach in decision theory, say in Leonard Savage's famous book on the foundation of statistics, which axiomatized the Bayesian approach. But it depended on specifying for all possible contingencies what you were going to do. But we know that there's another problem, which is that computation is costly. Computation, including under computation, I include things like logical inference, just carrying out. If I hold proposition A, I should also hold proposition B. But even enumerating the possibilities becomes an enormous and maybe impossible task. If you already have genuine innovations in the world, and there may be social innovations, but let's think of technology, by definition, you don't know what they're going to be. And it's true you might say, well, we could have this and that, but when they occur in a form you probably didn't even expect. So enumerating the possibilities to specify an action for each contingency is an additional cost. So therefore, Coase argued that having an authoritative relationship between employer and employee is more efficient than writing contracts to cover all contingencies or to leave the future to renegotiations. Now, one thing that Coase's statement of the problem seems to be where it seems to be require more development than is suggested by Coase is the governance of the firm. I've said before that the idea of the intra-firm communication is reliable. It depends on assumption that everybody in the firm is trying to do the same thing, which we think of as profit maximization. And that the firm, and that we assume the employees share the same. But now there's a large literature on the principal-agent problem. Managers or even individual workers have some discretion. In fact, that's why we have to have that's why authoritative relations are useful. And the actions may depend on information which is known only to the agent. So within the firm, we have asymmetric information. The assumption is that this information is freely transferred, but not necessarily. It may be in the interests of the individual within the firm to misrepresent, shall I say, not to respond to information. This is part of the general theory of economic behavior under asymmetric information, which has had a great development with applications to the professions and now to the financial sector. These are, the words that are the ordinary words that are tossed about, like moral hazard and adverse selection, which come ultimately from the insurance companies, the insurance literature, which where these problems were faced more explicitly than anywhere else. And I've stressed so far the problems of the managers, but what about the top management? What is the firm anyway? Or who constitutes the firm? It's an institution, which, okay, is something beyond an individual. But who are the members of it, and what are the relations of the members to it? Coase implicitly assumes that they're all working together. But there was a contemporary contemporary Coase's paper, and that's a study by Burley and Means, The Modern Corporation and Private Property, which I think is a classic book. And for example, he discussed the relation between the interests of management and the interests of stockholders. Ordinarily, the law says the stockholders are the owners of the firm. For a large firm, the relation of a stockholder to the firm is probably a lot less than that of the average worker. The stockholder feels quite free to buy and sell the stocks, doesn't feel committed to the firm in any real way. It's just an investment. In fact, this gave rise for a while, although somewhat later, in the 1960s, to a literature on managerial capitalism, where the item is the firm has run the interests of the management, not the interests of the stockholders. William Baumel, Robin Maris. Now, this work could be criticized. It didn't put enough emphasis on competitive pressures, so that you might, and the usual views of perfect competition, the firm has to maximize profits in order to survive. And since survival is presumably the interest of everybody in the firm, there is a common element. But the world is really dynamic. In fact, it's an important part of the Coase story, that the world be dynamic. Actually, there are uncertainties which are going to be resolved in the future. You do things today which have consequences for the future. Capital formation and production takes time, all these obvious characteristics which make capital such a prominent part of capitalism. The interests of management may depend on current expectations of the future, not what is actually going to happen. Well, I'm referring to the fact that people are paid bonuses with regard to current activities, because that's the way, how can you pay a bonus based on the future? Of course, one idea is to pay it in the future, but and indeed, the question of the collapse of 2008 has raised the question in many people's minds whether the incentives, in this case of managers of financial institutions, are necessarily aligned with the future of the firm as such. Finally, I've been talking long enough. I want to get, but let me just say a broader term, which I'll just discuss briefly. One of the questions is, why doesn't a firm use an internal price system? Maybe not the prices that are on the market, but its own price system. After all, we have a whole theory of welfare economics which says the way to get an optimal allocation is through the price system. In other words, you maximize and you have Lagrange multipliers. The Lagrange multipliers can be regarded as interpreted as prices. Linear programming as a theory of the firm, as a guide to the firm's activity, which was the original incentive for both Leonid Kantorovich in Russia and George Danzig in the United States. So you have the dual variables, which are essentially prices. So what it looks like, you should use a price system. After all, within the firm the information is reliable, presumably. The firm. So let me refer here to the socialist calculation controversy, which has been briefly mentioned in the term of reference to Abba Lerner. Well, it's got a whole history. There was socialism, the idea that socialist parties might come to power and actually have a socialist system raised the question of how would you run it. Pareto had already been interested in this question before the First World War, but it was immediately after, and particularly in Austria, where it's raised. And Ludwig von Mises wrote an article, well, you just can't allocate things naturally. You need prices. And this kicked off a whole lot of calculations. Schumpeter, one of Schumpeter's students, wrote Clara Tisch wrote an important paper, and then in the 30s it was revived by Lerner and by Oscar Lange. And in a way, you can put the matter the other way, though. If the price system isn't so good within the firm, and we have other methods of allocation, authoritative methods, why don't they work on the scale of the economy? I think it's a question that can be raised. I think now, I think the kind of answer, but it needs to be explored, is that prices really are imperfect. They do reveal scarcities and lack of scarcity. High prices, mean scarcity. They're not really very perfect signals. There are all sorts of reasons why commodities are too complicated to be fully expressed by prices and so forth. But if you're dealing with a remote part of the economy, for something far from you, the price is about as good as you can possibly get. And therefore, you should take account of that. Internally, when you have much more detailed information, you do not use prices. So the implications that a market price system with local non-price intra-firm allocations may be better than either a market system which covers the smallest and most local transactions or a centralized non-price-based allocation mechanisms. Thank you very much.